Hi folks, hope you're okay today. We're looking at this book and the historical reliability of the Old Testament, and it's been nitty-gritty scholarship and it's very detailed material. But if you want to know whether the Christian faith is true, you've got to be willing to do some thinking, and you've got to ask yourself, when Muslims and say the Bible's changed, when atheists say how do you know the text that you have is accurate, obviously by us looking at the Old Testament we can see how such questions are ignorant of how the Old Testament has been preserved. The Septuagint. Just as the Jews had abandoned their native Hebrew tongue for Aramaic in the Near East, so they abandoned the Aramaic in favour of Greek in such Hellenistic centres as Alexandria, Egypt. And during the campaign of Alexander the Great, the Jews were shown considerable favour. In fact, Alexander was sympathetic towards the Jews as a result of their policies towards him in the siege of Tyre in 332 BC. He is even reported to have travelled to Jerusalem to pay homage to their god. As he conquered new lands, he built new cities that frequently included Jewish inhabitants and often named them Alexandria. Because the Jews were scattered from their homeland, there was a need for the scriptures in the common language of that day. The name Septuagint means 70, and usually abbreviated by the use of the Roman numerals LXX, was given to the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures during the reign of the king Ptolemy of Philadelphia of Egypt 285 to 246 BC. F.F. Bruce offers an interesting rendering of the origin of the name for this translation, concerning a letter purporting to be written around 250 BC, more realistically a short time before 100 BC, by Aristeas, a court official of King Ptolemy, to his brother Philocrates. Bruce writes, Ptolemy was renowned as a patron of literature, and it was under him that the great library at Alexandria, one of the world's cultural wonders for 900 years, was inaugurated. The letter describes how Demetrius of Phalerum, said to have been Ptolemy's librarian, aroused the king's interest in the Jewish law, devising to send a delegation to the high priest Eleazar at Jerusalem. The high priest chose a translator, 6 elders from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and sent them to Alexandria along with a especially accurate and beautiful parchment of the Torah. The elders were royally dined and wined, and proved their wisdom in debate. Then they took up their residence in a house on the island of Pharos, the island otherwise famed for its lighthouse. When 22 days they completed their task of translating the Pentateuch into Greek, presenting an agreed version as the result of conference and comparison. F.F. Bruce. The Greek Old Testament of the Septuagint differs from the Hebrew canon in the quality of its translation as well as its constance and arrangement. In addition to the 22 books of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Septuagint contains a number of books that were never part of the Hebrew canon. Apparently those books were circulated in the Greek-speaking world but were never part of the Hebrew canon. The quality of translation in the Septuagint reflects the situation and provides for several observations. Number 1. The Septuagint varies in excellence, ranging from slavishly literal rendition of the Torah to free translation in the writings, the third division of the Hebrew Scriptures. See Frederick Kenyon, The Text of the Greek Bible, revised and augmented by A.W. Adams. Adams indicates that the text of Job in the original Septuagint is actually 1/6 shorter than its Hebrew counterpart. There are also large variations in Joshua, 1 Samuel, 1 Kings, Proverbs, Esther, and Jeremiah, as well as lesser variations in other books. The cause of the divergences is one of the major difficulties of the Septuagint. The Septuagint was not designed to have the same purpose as the Hebrew text, being used for public services in the synagogue rather than for scholarly or scribal purposes. The Septuagint was the product of a pioneer venture in transmitting the Old Testament scripture, and an excellent example of such an effort. The Septuagint was generally loyal to the readings of the original Hebrew text, although some have maintained that the translators were not always good Hebrew scholars. Regarding the Septuagint, Paul Enns noted that as a translation it is uneven, but it's helpful in that it is based on the Hebrew text 1,000 years older than our existing Hebrew manuscripts. Moreover, New Testament writers would at times quote from Septuagint. This provides us with further insights concerning the Old Testament text. As for the influence of the Septuagint, every page of this lexicon, a Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature, Bode, Arden and Ginch, shows that it outweighs all other influences on our 1st century AD literature. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, began in 250 BC, ranks next to the Masoretic text in importance. It was widely used in the New Testament times, and may be seen from the fact that the majority of the 250 Old Testament citations in the New Testament are from this version. When the Septuagint diverged from the Masoretic text, some scholars assumed that the Septuagint translations had taken liberties with her text. We now know from Qumran that many of these differences were due to the fact that the translators were following a somewhat different Hebrew text belonging to what we may call the Proto-Septuagint family. The Septuagint being very close to the Masoretic text, AD 916, we have today, helps to establish the reliability of its transmission through 1300 years. The Septuagint and the scriptural citations found in the apocryphal books of Ecclesiasticus, the Book of Jubilees and others give evidence that the Hebrew text today is substantially the same as the text about 300 BC. Geisler and Nix give 4 important contributions of the Septuagint. Number 1, it bridged the religious gap between the Hebrew and the Greek-speaking peoples as it met the needs of the Alexandrian Jews. Number 2, it bridged the historical gap between the Old Testament of the Jews and the Greek-speaking Christians who would use it with their New Testament. 3, it provided a precedent for missionaries to make translations of the scriptures into various languages and dialects. And number 4, it bridges the textual criticism gap by its substantial agreement with the Hebrew Old Testament text. F.F. Bruce gives 2 reasons why the Jews lost interest in the Septuagint. From the 1st century AD onwards, the Christians adopted it as their version of the Old Testament and used it freely in their propagation and defense of the Christian faith. About AD 100, a revised standard text was established for the Hebrew Bible by Jewish scholars. What began as a popular Jewish translation of the Old Testament eventually lost much of its appeal to the Jewish people. But the point is, it was a popular translation. It wasn't perfect, but it was generally accurate to the Hebrew text. That's the point that you need to grab hold of. And so that was some detailed scholarship there for you to think about. But basically, the Septuagint is a faithful, generally a faithful rendition of the Old Testament, a Greek rendition of the Hebrew Old Testament. Okay, it was popular. It wasn't perfect, but when you have that and you have thousands of other ancient Hebrew and other manuscripts of the Old Testament, you put it all together and you do find that the Old Testament has been preserved faithfully. Okay, alright,